Good evening and welcome to another lecture in the series called Perspectives on Economic Liberty that's hosted by the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, which is part of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at ASU. Cecil's Perspectives series emerges from its mission, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to pursue that mission is to revisit the history of debates over economic liberty. One of those debates centered around the award of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, 50 years ago this month, to Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal. Our speaker this afternoon to introduce us to this discussion and debate between Hayek and Myrdal and the types of economics and Hayek in particular is Bruce Caldwell, research professor of economics and director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. For the past 3 decades, Bruce's research has focused on Hayek's work. He is the author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of Hayek. He's the general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek. How many volumes?
19.
19 volumes, that's individual books of work by Hayek. And he's the editor of the transcripts of the founding meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. And the title is MPS 1947. He is also currently working on a family-authorized biography of Hayek titled simply Hayek, A Life. Is that still the title? Good. Please welcome Bruce to ASU. There's going to be ample time for questions after the talk.
So thank you very much, Ross. And I didn't bring my glasses with me, so you're all just a blur. I'm wondering if people would mind moving up a little closer so that I don't just see a mass of... It's kind of like if you're watching TV and it suddenly gets blurry, you know? Yeah, there we go. That's the thing. Besides, you know, once people hear about this talk, they'll be pouring in from the back. And we want to give them an ability to sit down and be able to see. Thank you very much for indulging me on that. So yeah, so we're here to celebrate and discuss the 50th anniversary of the jointly awarded Nobel Prize to Hayek and Myrdal. And I think if people know something about Hayek, they probably have heard about the debate with John Maynard Keynes. So Hayek went from Austria to the London School of Economics in the early 30s, and on arriving, he engaged in a debate with Keynes about their respective theories of the business cycle. And he's also known as a critic of socialism. So he had some essays in the 1930s on socialism. And of course, the most famous critique would be The Road to Serfdom, completed during the war years. And those who know even more about Hayek might know about the knowledge problem, his contribution to what has been dubbed the knowledge problem, the idea that a well-functioning market system is actually, he used the word a marvel in the use of knowledge in society, his most famous paper, a kind of a marvel for coordinating human action in a world of dispersed and subjectively held knowledge, where lots of different people have different bits of knowledge, yet coordination can occur through a well-functioning market system. So what most people don't know about Hayek's contribution, though, is to the field of economic methodology or scientific methodology. So what is this strange word methodology? It asks questions like, is there a scientific method? What does it mean when we say that a particular discipline is a science? Do all sciences follow the same method? How do we validate whether something is a science or not? Are there criteria for assessing the scientificity of various fields? Now, I have to say, my own interest in Hayek was initially stimulated by those sorts of questions. And it was through a very innocent process, really. And it looks like most of the people, but perhaps not all of the people here, are undergraduates. And I enjoyed my undergraduate education in economics. I thought it helped me learn things about the world that I didn't know before I studied economics. And then when I went to grad school was really different, really strange, I thought. I approached it with a certain amount of wonderment as well as horror, because it was tough, but it seemed like we weren't learning stuff that I thought might be necessary for the next step in the training of an economist. So in terms of the theory courses, it was a lot of the same theory, but it was just expressed in higher level mathematics, basically. So I didn't really feel like I was learning anything new. I was just struggling to learn the mathematics to express these ideas in a different way. There was also more empirical work, so we're learning empirical techniques through econometrics classes. But then I'd get to my applied classes. I can distinctly remember the first day of my industrial organization class, and the professor said, look, we're going to look at literally hundreds of studies, empirical studies, of various market structure, all these different sorts of questions that might be associated with industrial organization. And he said, but there's only, I think, 2 robust relationships that we're going to see. And I said, you learn all this econometrics, you do all these studies, but there don't seem to be the kinds of relationships that you might have in physics within economics. So I was baffled by it, and I became interested in learning what it means to be a science, what those sorts of questions, because of that experience. And indeed did my dissertation looking at a field called the philosophy of science. These are people who are saying, trying to answer those methodological questions that I posed at the outset. And then looked also at some of the writings of famous economists who have written about methodological topics. Paul Samuelson, Milton Friedman, Terence Hutchison, Fritz Machlup. There was a host of them. I didn't really feel like I had answered the question that I had posed, but that was how I got into the study of methodology. And in that dissertation, what I found was that most economists were at least giving credit to a philosophy of science called logical positivism, but actually logical empiricism would be the form that it was in the 1950s, 1960s, when some of these people who were economists were writing about what it means to be a scientific discipline. And what they held out was a vision of a cumulatively progressive field that tests hypotheses, rejects falsified hypotheses, builds up in a cumulatively progressive way a body of theory that is well tested. And indeed, the emphasis on testing was such that, at least in one formulation, it was stated that the best theories are, what you're going to do if you have progress in the sciences, you're going to be able to make ever more precise predictions of phenomena within that field. Okay? So that was the image of science that a lot of economists who had written about methodological issues had said. Hayek challenged all of that. Okay? My book, Hayek's Challenge, was titled An Intellectual Biography of F.A. Hayek, but it wasn't an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek. The actual subtitle to that book was supposed to be F.A. Hayek and the Limits of Social Science. And the editor at the University of Chicago Press said, that'll never sell. Let's just call it an intellectual biography, which I did. And of course, as soon as it gets reviewed, the reviewers are saying, this isn't an intellectual biography. This is about the limits of social science, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it's not like I'm writing the same book over again. Ross was teasing me about that before I started my talk. So he was saying, well, economics is a science. Okay, he's not disputing that. But he's saying it's a science that faces certain limits. And this was such an important idea for him that when he got awarded the Nobel Prize, his address, although he mentions economics in the address, a lot of it's about methodology. So what I'd like to do is explore how he came to the views that he did, why he came to the views that he did, put it within the context of the times, and then bring us forward to the 1974 Nobel ceremony. He gives his talk in December. Myrdal, who is the exact opposite of Hayek on all of their beliefs, gives his talk in March. And these are dueling talks in the end. This is what it looks like. And talk a little bit about the aftermath, and then we'll see if we can draw some conclusions. And hopefully, those of you who are training to become economists, perhaps you'll share some of your conclusions about this debate as well. So let me take you back to the early 1930s, as I said. And by the way, when we're done, I am a guy who's written a lot about Hayek. So if you want to talk about anything about Hayek that's not methodology in the Q&A, we can do that too. Happy to do that. But the focus of the talk will be on this particular topic. So he gets in these academic debates when he first gets to the London School of Economics in the early 30s with John Maynard Keynes about the theory of the cycle, and with LSE was founded by Fabian socialists. So many of the people who were on the faculty were socialists, and they were arguing and making models about how you would run a socialist society. And Hayek and his colleagues Lionel Robbins and Arnold Plant were more free market sorts of people. So there was lots of academic debates. But much more important for the subsequent development of his ideas was the popularity of socialist planning in the public at large, and in particular the advocacy of this by what he termed, and they termed themselves, the men of science. These are people who would say in a public address, speaking as a man of science, and then would go on to say whatever they were talking about. And there's a C.P. Snow actually has a series of novels about Cambridge academia where he talks about these people who are quite full of themselves. Okay, now these are brilliant people. Some of them went on to get Nobel Prizes, but there was a group of natural scientists in a variety of disciplines who were everywhere in terms of media. Okay, they were giving public lectures. There were book clubs where their books would be touted, like a Book of the Month club sort of thing in Britain. There were things on the BBC, okay, radio program, writing into newspapers. They're everywhere. Okay, these are people who carry the authority of science, and they're commenting on their society. Think of the society in England in the early and mid 1930s. Okay, you're in the middle of the Great Depression. England was in a terrible shape all through the 20s. It got worse in the 1930s. You're sitting there on the edge of Europe, and you've got the Soviet Union as one experiment of how to organize a society. So you've got communism. You've got fascism of a variety of sorts in Spain and Portugal and Italy. You've got Nazism emerging in Germany. And you're saying, look, capitalism has collapsed. These other alternatives don't look too good. Most of the intelligentsia in Britain embraced socialist planning as the appropriate way to organize society. And most of these social, or rather men of science, were advocating just that. I'll give you just a couple of quotes. And if you're interested in this, in some of these books that he mentioned, there's a lot more detail. But one of them, named J.D. Bernal, if science is to help, excuse me, if science is to help humanity, it must find a new master. Finding a new master meaning have a new sort of social organization. P.M.S. Blackett, who was a physicist who went on to win a Nobel Prize in 1948 in physics, wrote a book that collected essays by various of his other natural science colleagues. And the book was called The Frustration of Science. And in his concluding essay, Blackett says, well, we really have a choice here. The choice is between fascism or full socialism. And I vote for full socialism, and I implore other men of science to join me in this endeavor. One of the people that was on LSE faculty with Robbins and Hayek was a social biologist named, what kind of parent would do this to a kid? Lancelot Hogben. He was named Lancelot, okay? And he was a nasty piece of work. I mean, there was a biography of him I read. He was terrible to his parents. He's terrible to all of his colleagues. Never got along anywhere. Wasn't at LSE very long before he was gone. But he was one of the most prominent of these men of science. He was actually gave this very noted address. He was one of the few people who was invited to give it twice. Okay, he gave it, like 15 years apart. And in his address, he had the audacity to call out by name Lionel Robbins and mention Hayek peripherally by saying Austrian, Austrian. This is during the 1930s, okay? If you have a German name, it has kind of a bad odor if you're in England at this time, okay? He says, the stuff that they're propounding, this economics they call as a science, is the astrology of the machine age. It's metaphysical nonsense. These are direct quotes. You get the picture. It's not science. Economics is not science. Economics talks about scarcity, and it has a number of ideas that was rejected by people who say, look, economics is raising questions about the viability of socialism. If we get rid of this idea, this fake science, we will be able to usher in a new age. Okay, this was a very persuasive argument. If you're living in Britain in the middle of the 1930s, it's certainly the idea that science could be used to help you plan. And Hayek thought, well, yeah, these people have the popular attention. What will I do to answer them? Now, being Hayek, what he decides is he's going to write a 2-volume massive work, okay? And in the first volume, he's going to say, here's a set of ideas that started in post-revolutionary France, post-Napoleonic France at the École Polytechnique. Two of the people that were affiliated with the École were Henri de Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte. Saint-Simon is known as one of the founders of socialism. There were other socialist ideas before him, but associationism and socialism kind of came from Saint-Simon. And Comte for positivism. Okay, so the logical positivists look back to Comte in their writings. So he's saying these ideas of positivism and socialism moving through different countries through time, that ideas traveling from country to country, starting in France, going to Germany, going to England, coming to the United States. And in each place it takes a very different form because you're talking very different countries, different stages of development, etc. In Germany, that was trying to make its empire great, it was German conservative imperialists who were embracing some of these ideas. In England, it was Fabian socialists. In the United States, it was progressives during the progressive era. But all of them had an image that experts could use science to reconstruct society. This was the idea that he thought they all shared. So this big 2-volume work was going to say, here's the origins of these ideas that Hayek thought were pernicious, and here's how they're being actualized in the 20th century with some very bad results. So that was what he was going to do, and he ends up writing an essay that was going to be part of this larger work called Scientism and the Study of Society. Scientism and the Study of Society. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Now, by the way, he doesn't finish the 2-volume work. He realizes this is a stupid idea. It's not going to actually convince anyone, this big, massive work. He ends up doing The Road to Serfdom, which of course does get attention and kind of propels him into the spotlight. But that was another project. In terms of the scientism work, this one essay that he wrote, I think encapsulates a lot of his ideas. So, he defines scientism, I'm going to read from the essay, as the slavish imitation of the method and language of science, a very prejudiced approach which, before it is considered its subject, claims to know what is the most appropriate way of investigating it. In his essay, he contrasted the scientistic approach that he disliked with the approach to the social sciences that he thought was more appropriate. And he offers general categories. He says, well, there's the objectivism and collectivism and historicism of the scientistic approach. And he says, I contrast that with the approach I favor, which is subjectivist, individualist, and theoretical. And if those of you who are studying economics and think about adjectives that you would use to describe the economics approach, you have a subjective theory of value, you're building up theories from the actions of individuals, and it's a theoretical approach, okay? If you just think your intro or intermediate micro classes, those would all be words that you would use to describe the theories that you use. So in his essay, he lumps together lots of different groups that he dislikes under the scientific approach. So for objectivism, you've got something like behavioral psychology, which says you're not really doing scientific psychology unless you're referring to observable behaviors. You can't be talking about people's thoughts. It has to be just a behavioral approach. In terms of collectivist, he doesn't mention Keynes by name or Wesley Clare Mitchell by name, but American institutionalism and Keynesian economics would be examples there. He does talk a little bit about sociology and approaches that, particularly in German sociology, that had been emerging. And for historicism, you've got the German historical school, which was the traditional enemy of the Austrians. So anyway, what kinds of conclusions does he draw from this critique of scientism? One of his most important conclusions was that if you're taking the approach that he favors, he says you're not going to be able to make point predictions in the way that actually many people say that's the way science is supposed to be. He says what you'll be able to do is explain the principle by which phenomena occur and make pattern predictions. So in the scientism essay, he has the example of a footpath. He says, look, if you're an objectivist, if you're a behaviorist, you're going to say, what have I observed in terms of where a footpath comes from? Now, you happen to be on a campus. Is there green spaces on campus? Sort of. In some campuses, you have lots of green spaces. And what you have on campuses like that is you've got footpaths everywhere, okay? You've got the sidewalks that they laid out, and then you have the footpaths that people use to get from point A to point B, most of it. Has everyone ever seen a footpath get created? No. They're just there, okay? But if we think, we can explain the principle by which a footpath gets created. We don't need observation. We understand the way that this sort of social phenomena gets established without having to have direct observation, which is what some of these claims about how to be real science was saying. An example that he doesn't use so much in the scientism essay, but he uses a lot later, is evolutionary theory. If you think of your science classes, evolutionary theory is based on three principles: variation, heritability, and selection for traits that enhance survival and reproductive success. These are the principles by which speciation occurs, that different species get created. Can we predict the path of speciation? I can't pronounce it, but you know what I mean. No, we can't, because there's so many variables that are going on. But we understand the principles by which they can occur. If we think of a market, when you have your demand and supply instruction, Econ 101, you lay out the determinants of demand, the determinants of supply. And you know they all interact in a market to determine equilibrium price or the price that you perceive in a market. But are you going to be able to predict the price of wheat 6 months from now? No, because all these things are going on that would potentially disturb it, cause it to go up, go down, whatever. So he's saying that these are the characteristics of many social sciences. And we shouldn't be using the scientific approach that has been argued for by others. He says the danger is that we will embrace, if we don't understand this, what he called an engineering mentality. The idea that we can engineer social phenomena in the same way that engineers build bridges or design structures. And he says that's dangerous because we're not going to be able to accomplish it given the limitations that he's identified. Okay, so no one reads the scientism essay. It's published in the LSE House Journal Economica. He was the editor at the time that it got published, so it got accepted for publication by him. Okay, so he decides to bring it out in a book, but he's actually working on some other stuff, Constitution of Liberty, stuff that has to do with promoting liberalism, the same sorts of ideas that were going on in the road to serfdom. But he moves to the University of Chicago in 1950, starts running seminars, and in 1952-53 he runs this seminar that he would look back on later and say, this is the high point intellectually of my entire life. Okay, so something pretty big. So the name of this seminar that he runs, year-long seminar, is Scientific Method and the Study of Society. And he has a whole bunch of readings, but he also assigns two. One is the book that he just completed on psychology called The Sensory Order. The other is The Counter-Revolution of Science, which contains that scientism essay. And he thought that these were two of his own contributions to this larger debate. Now, the people who were assembled for this seminar over the year, he sent out invitations to a large group of people. We know at least some of them who attended, perhaps not every one, but every seminar, but they would reminisce that they were at it. It's just an amazing group. There's Hayek, there's people like Frank Knight. We're not sure how much Frank Knight went to it. Not sure. I'll have to, something to, yeah, he's one of the few people who Hayek said were coming, he checked. And some people who didn't come, he drew a line through. Frank Knight has a check and a line. Okay, so maybe he started to come and then he decided not to. Hard to know. But Milton Friedman's there, Aaron Director, his brother-in-law, Gary Becker, who was just a grad student at the time. These are, for those of you who are not economists, these are really famous economists. Abba Lerner, who was a socialist that engaged in the socialist calculation debate. There were also some other economists who were affiliated with the Coles Commission that was there at the University of Chicago, who were Friedman's. They were at each other's throats constantly during the period that they were there. The Coles Commission finally said, we've had it, we're going to Yale, and they moved out in 1955. But during this early 50s, they were constantly at each other's throats about a number of different things. Methodology, the Coles Commission people were mostly socialist. Friedman was a free market guy. They liked Keynesian economics, he liked monetarism. Okay? They were all going for funding. This is the beginning of the Cold War is really starting to heat up. You've got the Korean police action taking place. So a lot of government funding out there. There's foundations and government funding. They're all competing for it, and they're trying to say, we're the real scientists, those ones aren't, okay? Because money's involved, okay? So you've got all these things taking place. These people are all at this seminar that he's running, talking about what it means to be a science, okay? There's a lot at stake there, a lot at stake. Now, we don't have any notes to what happened at the seminar. We just have some reminiscences. There's three things that I think we can safely say. First of all, no one understood the sensory order at all, okay? This is an impossible book to read if you're sitting down for a long time. You're not going to read it before a nightly seminar. So that is probably off the table. The second thing is that this is where Friedman tries out an essay that would become a very famous methodological essay. The Methodology of Positive Economics is its title, and the title kind of says it all. He's saying this is the way that you do real economics. And it was in this essay that he made the claim that the key to a successful theory is its ability to predict. It doesn't matter, the realism of assumptions don't matter, none of that. Its predictive ability is its key. And that's what we should judge him by. And if two theories are equally good at prediction, which they never are in the social sciences, choose the one that's simpler. That was basically the message that he was giving people. Now, Hayek knew the people that he was attacking when he was attacking scientism. Most of them were socialist or left-wing. He disagreed with them for a variety of reasons. He didn't like the conservative imperialists that were in Germany. But here he's got Milton Friedman, who's ideologically he's very similar to, mouthing the exact same thing that he thinks is wrong. So it's not just the socialists, it's everybody. And the people he's disagreeing with on the Coles Commission, they're both fighting with each other, but they both agree that the way to do science is to be able to accomplish these particular better predictions, okay? Now, if that were not enough, he gets reviews of this book and the scientism essay by philosophers of science of his day, and they're all saying he's wrong. You don't distinguish between the natural sciences and the social sciences in this way. All real sciences follow the same method. So everybody thought he was wrong if they noticed what he was saying at all, okay? This is where Hayek is in 1952-53. So being Hayek, what does he do? He writes another paper, okay? This is called Degrees of Explanation. Degrees of Explanation. And he sends this out to a guy who sends it to Warren Weaver, who was the director of the Division of Natural Sciences at the Rockefeller Foundation. Hayek is very well connected. You know, these are important and thoughtful people. And Warren Weaver sends back a bunch of comments on the paper and sends along a paper called Science and Complexity. And this ends up being a light bulb moment for Hayek. And let me just, as an aside, so I'm an historian of economics, and I'm writing this biography that Ross talked about. The first volume's out, and I get a couple of months after it was out, I get an email from a guy who was a student of Hayek's in 1955 and attended the seminar where Hayek gave this paper, Degrees of Explanation. And this guy sends me a 100-page description that he had written over the years of what it was like at Chicago in the 1950s. Gold. This is gold. This is unsolicited. This guy out of nowhere. This is some of the wonderful things about the life I live. I just can't believe how blessed I am. And he says, yeah, I was at that. I think I've got the paper. And he sent me the paper, the original paper that Hayek had distributed at the seminar in fall of 1954. The reason that's significant is it was before this Warren Weaver footnote was added. Okay, this was his first giving of the seminar. And then he reads this paper by Warren Weaver. So Warren Weaver was making the following argument. He said, if we look at the history of science, it initially started out in places that were like in fields like physics and other disciplines. These were solving two variable problems. And they were able to make point predictions. Think about predicting when an eclipse is going to occur. Okay? You're able to make very precise predictions when you have this. And he calls these simple phenomena. Even though physics is very difficult, he's calling these simple phenomena. He says, around 1900, scientists started to investigate phenomena of what he called disorganized complexity, in which a number of variables was large and the individual behavior is independent. And he said, for such phenomena, you can do statistical analysis. You're not going to get point predictions. You're going to get probabilities associated with being able to predict what's occurring with those sorts of phenomena. He said, the last frontier is what we're just reaching now, the study of organized complexity. Here, there's a large number of variables. They're interrelated in various ways. So you can't use the usual statistical techniques. Tellingly for Hayek, one of his examples that Warren Weaver gives was the price of wheat in his little article. He's saying, yeah, this would be like trying to predict the price of wheat six months hence. So in his paper, Hayek says, okay, I have a footnote. The problems of complexity to which the further discussion refers are of the kind which Warren Weaver has described as problems of organized complexity. So let me be very clear here. Hayek already had the idea that the social sciences that he was interested in, particularly economics, it was difficult to make anything more than pattern predictions or explanations of the principle, and he divided that as a social science, natural science sort of thing. When he discovered Warren Weaver, he realized that the real distinction was between sciences that study complex phenomena versus those which study simple phenomena. There's going to be degrees of explanation of how much you're going to be able to do depending on the subject matter that you're studying. And he gave other examples. He mentioned evolutionary theory. He mentions mathematical biology and mathematical economics as being this, because if you think of a Walrasian system, a general equilibrium system, you're not going to be able to fill in all of the variables, but you'll be able to see the structure of the system through the mathematics of a general equilibrium thing. Cybernetics, theory of automata, general systems theory. He recognized the limitations that these sciences faced, but his claim was that this is a real science. I'm going to read one, let me see where I am. No, I won't. I won't read the one long quote because it's a beautiful quote of what he says. Yeah, I'll read it quickly. If it's true that in subjects of great complexity we must rely to a large extent on such mere explanations of the principle, we must not overlook some disadvantages connected with this technique. Such theories are difficult to disprove. The elimination of rival theories will be a slow affair. There'll be no crucial experiment which allows to decide between them. There'll be no safeguards even against sheer quackery. But it does not help to hold up against this the example of other sciences where the situation is different. There's no basis for the contention that the differences are due to the immaturity of the sciences concerned. It'd be a complete misunderstanding of the argument to think that it deals with the provisional and transitory state of the progress of those sciences which they're bound to overcome sooner or later. In other words, we're never going to be able to get to that nirvana point that the positivists were holding out for economics in dealing with economics. We have to be content with these limits, the limits of social science. He writes more about this. He goes to Freiburg, he goes to Salzburg. 1974 in October, he gets the telegram, you're getting the Nobel Prize. So what does he decide to do? As I said, he does talk a little bit about economics, but he really wants to make this a talk about these methodological limitations. He gives a toast the night before his address, and he starts it by saying, if I had been consulted whether to establish a Nobel Prize in economics, I should have decidedly advised against it. Okay? So he's already setting him up for the speech the next day. So back up a little bit. He's getting this with Myrdal. These two guys know each other. Hayek in the 30s was editing a volume that was going to be published in German, and he had invited a Swedish economist named Lindahl to contribute an essay. At the last minute, Lindahl says, no, I can't, but I've got this student named Gunnar Myrdal. He wrote a paper in Swedish. We'll translate it into German, and you could use that. How's that? Hayek looks at this thing. He hates the paper, but he feels obligated because he invited this prominent guy. This paper gets translated into English at the end of the 30s. It's called Monetary Equilibrium. It's like a fairly extended article. And this is one of the bases for which Myrdal gets the Nobel Prize. So Hayek helped this guy get the Nobel Prize, which both of them know. And both of them, they don't like each other. They had never liked each other. So this is the little trick that the Nobel Committee was pulling on them. You can get some sense of the differences in their approach because the New York Times interviews them when the prize was announced, and they said, how would you respond to the inflation that's building in the United States? It's 1974. Stagflation was starting to really take off, but it was going to get much worse. Myrdal says wage and price controls and gasoline rationing. Okay? Hayek said a temporary increase in unemployment will be necessary to reduce it. Okay? Two really different approaches. By the way, Myrdal's was the one that everybody believed in the 70s. Remember, Nixon in 1971 imposed a 90-day wage price freeze, and then this was gradually taken off. These controls were gradually taken off over the next few years, and there was a lot of distortions. But this was viewed as a popular kind of here's how you deal with inflation. You just say we're going to make it illegal. Okay, you're not allowed to raise prices. So they really have these two very different approaches. So in his paper, he starts off by saying, great line, I have to talk about accelerating inflation, which it must be admitted has been brought about by policies which the majority of economists recommend or even urge governments to pursue. As a profession, we have made a mess of things. He's being polite there. He's saying they made a mess of things. I've never supported these things. But he goes on to say, okay, the reason that we're making these errors is that we're following the wrong philosophy of science. Well, we're following the wrong policy framework, Keynesian demand management. He never uses Keynes's name, but he talks about demand management, so it's Keynesian demand management. And he says, and the reason that this is such a popular approach is it seems like it's scientific because you're dealing with aggregates, which are numbers, like the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, and these things look scientific. Okay? He said if you really look at the economy, we don't have data on a big market economy of the sort that we would, you just don't know what's going on if you think about the economic system in the way that he does. You have market outcomes that are determined by millions of decisions of firms and households. You just don't have the data that would be necessary if you thought you wanted to plan something. And so instead we're making use of these big aggregates, and their relationship to the actual economy is vague at best. I'll just tell you as an aside, I mean, I was in the 70s studying economics as an undergraduate, and then when I went to grad school, I was TAing for a large macroeconomics class. And it was, what we do is we spend about 3 weeks building a Keynesian model, calculating the multiplier. You'd have GNP and full employment GNP, so there was a GNP gap, and then you just plug in the numbers, calculate the numbers, and you get, here's how much you need to increase aggregate demand to get to full employment GNP, okay? So this was a very mechanical, it was like, this is what economists do. We just plug in the numbers. Where these numbers come from is the kind of thing that Hayek is saying. And actually as a student, and also someone trying to teach it, stagflation didn't make sense of this. This model didn't make sense in a period of stagflation. In the model, you either had unemployment, you get up to full employment, and low inflation. If you stimulate too much, you get inflation. So you have unemployment or inflation. Stagflation has both of them. So it was a strange period, but this was the kind of economics that was going on, at least at my perception of it as a teacher. Economics is only an example, though, and what Hayek refers to is the 1972 study, The Limits to Growth, a 1972 book warning of resource depletion, population growth, environmental degradation. It actually was based on models that are the kind of the precursors of the climate change models of today. So this is one of the earliest interventions about how the world is going into a very bad place. And he was critical of it. And by the way, he ends up becoming has a nice correspondence with Julian Simon. I don't know if people know that name, but he was someone who challenged Paul Ehrlich to a bet about resource depletion. And if you want to, I'll tell you a little bit about that later, but I don't want to get, I'm supposed to talk till 6, is that right? Or is that right? Yeah, okay, I'm in good shape. Okay, so Myrdal, as I said, Myrdal talks a couple of months later. He's heard Hayek's talk, and he is ready to come out and challenge it, okay? So he's challenging it. So the title of his talk is The Equality Issue in World Development. The world, especially the developing world, says Myrdal, was facing enormous challenges. The oil crisis, but also a food crisis, a population explosion, the depletion of non-renewable resources, basically echoing the limits of growth arguments that were being made. The amount of humanitarian aid as opposed to military aid given by the US and many other developed countries to the developing world was minuscule. Okay, he really he targeted the United States a lot because the Vietnam War was just ending, and I remember traveling in Europe in the early 70s. Boy, you wanted to have a Canadian flag on your backpack because you got a lot of grief from people who didn't like the Vietnam episode. If catastrophe is to be avoided, the lavish level of consumption in the developed world needs to be reduced, and aid to the developing world correspondingly increased. And he advocated for then a new world order, okay? So what's to be done? The cutting down of consumption, of production for home consumption, of many other items besides food, in all of the developed countries is rational, and it's in our own interest. Our economic growth in a true sense could certainly be continued, but it needs to be directed differently in a planned way to serve the real interests of the world. He invokes the idea of this men of science. You can just imagine Hayek listening to this lecture going, oh, yeah. He says, I'm in deep sympathy with the urgings of medical men, environmentalists, and other colleagues in the natural sciences when they speak for the rationality in our own interest individually and still more collectively of a much more frugal lifestyle. And so far as growth in consumption, production for home consumption of many products. So invoking, again, his fellow scientists in the natural sciences. And he ends his talk saying, well, he's still, even though it sounds gloomy, he's optimistic because of his faith in science. That science is going to show us the way ahead. The responses to the two different talks are telling. So Hayek had been at LSE from 1931 through 1950, had been the editor of Economica during World War II, and he thought it would be a nice gesture to offer his lecture to Economica, the journal, for publication. It'd be a special thing. And he got a response from the Economica editor, Ray Richardson. He said that he did accept his paper, but he preferred a revised version. And I quote from his letter, noting, it was the general opinion of the editors and the board that the Nobel Prize ceremony probably inhibits laureates from giving a scholarly and well-ordered account of their views as they would wish. And then he provided 5 points where Hayek might make revisions. He says, we'll accept the paper, but if you're really, here's what you should do. So Hayek just withdrew it, okay? So he published it elsewhere, published it in the Swedish journal. Myrdal's lecture had a very different response. And by the way, this is very much the way things were in the 70s. I mean, this is, Hayek becomes famous with Thatcher and Reagan in the 80s, but in the 70s, the reason that the 80s happened was the way the 70s were. I mean, if you want to think about it that way. But a couple of years after Myrdal's lecture was given, Alfred Kastner, a Nobel laureate in physics, sent out a circular letter to all of the people who had received a Nobel Prize who were still alive, saying, look, you need to read and to meditate upon Myrdal's lecture, and reminded them of their responsibility to use their public prestige to help make things go in the right direction and to prevent the misuse of science. Now, this is something that Hayek thought was being the opposite of being truly scientific. Indeed, he sent a telegram to Kastner to strongly protest against political abuse of the prestige of Nobel laureates and supporting agitation for socialist experiments that will only prolong the agony of suffering peoples. So this was his view of it. Of course, no one knew about that telegram, but if you work in the archives, you see it. Okay, I'll conclude just with a couple of observations, and we'll just open it up. Again, emphasizing he did think of economics as a science, but one, because it studies complex phenomena, is limited in what it can accomplish. He thought it was important for generations, every new generation of economists to understand that. So his message was aimed at economists, to be sure. Fritz Machlup, which was one of his colleagues, once said the best definition of an economist is someone who can tell you today why his forecast for tomorrow that he made yesterday was wrong, okay? That you can if you can explain that, then you can explain the determinants of whatever happened, but you're not going to be able to forecast it in a good way. But I think he thought even more dangerous was if the public came to think that economists could do more than they could, because they're invariably going to be disappointed, and that then leads people to say economics is a bunch of hogwash. We don't need to think about economics. And he thought there are important lessons from economics about, now a lot of it's just applied common sense, but about what policies you shouldn't embrace. There's a guy at the University of Chicago named Henry Simons who had on his syllabus, academic economics is primarily useful both to the student and the political leader as a prophylactic against popular fallacies. So this is what I think Hayek thought the use of economics was, is to keep people from doing things that sound good that end up hurting the very people that you're trying to help. So I think that is part of that that he would have taken from all of this. But maybe you have different ideas. So let's stop here and open it up. Thanks.
Well, we will open the floor for questions. I will bring the microphone around if you would like to ask our speaker a question. Who would like to kick us off? Students in the back.
Okay, well, this is probably obvious, but I was just curious at the beginning when you were speaking about in the 30s, in the middle of the Great Recession, it seemed like the choice was either fascism or socialism. And why was that? Is that because they thought capitalism had failed because of the recession, or
The Great Depression,
Great
right?
Depression?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it looked like a free market society just was not viable, and so people were looking for alternatives. And they looked over there and they said that doesn't look good. But socialism, and it was usually called democratic socialism to emphasize that this is going to be fully consistent with our beliefs in democracy. It's not going to be like central planning in the Soviet Union, which is top down. This is a way to have more social justice, more fair distribution of income, and more efficient. And the vision was that capitalism had collapsed, but if you planned things, you could. We all engage in planning. Lionel Robbins, Hayek's friend at the LSE, said that planning is the great panacea. But tell me what you mean by planning. How you're going to be doing it? We plan individually, but Hayek had a great line in the Road to Serfdom: the more the state plans, the more difficult it is for individuals to plan, for people to plan, because then you have to take into account all of the different things that you're confronting in making your own decisions. So it was particularly in England, among the intelligentsia, and these people who were the men of science were speaking to the intelligentsia, but they're also speaking, as I said, in public ways that lots of people would have heard it.
But did they have any successful examples of that?
They were proposing a new Jerusalem. And so the Fabian socialism got started in the 1880s and 90s, and they had lots of position papers by the time that they got through the Great Depression. That certainly stimulated them, but some of them were even earlier. And I think it was as early as the late teens or early 20s that nationalization of the means of production was a plank in the Labor Party's platform. So a lot of, not all of them, I mean, they were all different variants, but a lot of the Fabian socialists were writing position papers for the Labor Party, basically. And Labor won in a landslide in after World War II. So that was when it started to happen. They started to get some examples of that.
Other questions?
Would you say that this would be part of the argument between a mechanical system and an organic system?
Yes.
And that Hayek saw early that the economy is more of an organic system made by people and for people, although organized, highly complex organized, but organic, and such that would resist a mechanic approach, which would be the opposite side.
Right. That's a very insightful comment. And indeed, in the Nobel lecture, he says that the metaphor that he likes for the economist is not the engineer, but the gardener. What a gardener does is to try to set the soil and other environmental things so that the individual plants can thrive and prosper. And that's what I think liberalism of the sort that he was defending in Constitution of Liberty is to say, what is the liberal goal? Take over the world and leave people alone. Basically set up the situation that they can best figure out how to thrive, because each person is going to be different about that. So yeah, it's a very good insight.
Other? Yeah.
to re-clarify what you said about what Hayek was talking about during his Nobel talk, is that these larger social systems, we can understand the principles which govern them instead of so much the very individual and precise, like, mathematical calculations that we would use for, like, finding out when a solar eclipse is going to happen?
Yes. If you think about your Econ 101 class, I think that the Hayekian message would fit in very well with that. So you start out with the notion of that we live in a world of scarcity, that scarcity makes choice necessary, and that there are trade-offs. If you choose one thing, you can't choose something else, okay? If you're on that production possibilities frontier, more of one means less of the other. But with growth, you can get beyond that constraint. You can push back against scarcity, okay? And how do you get the economy to grow? Well, you increase the number of people and the quality of people in the sense of human capital, education, what you're doing here at the university. Increase physical capital, increase the quality of capital, technological change. Specialization in trade, something that goes back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo. These are a series of ideas that developed over 250 years of people thinking about how an economy works that he thought were important elements. But it's not directing, I'm going to increase this by this much and we'll get this as an outcome sort of approach. It's an idea of how does this system as a whole work, and what can we do to unfetter it, to allow it to grow. Now, there are questions about, what are the effects of growth? There's some downsides to growth, but a lot of times, the opponents of growth tends to be a first world complaint. If you talk to people in less developed countries, growth is something that is really quite important for survival. And I think that this is the insight that this approach to economics takes. The Myrdal approach and other approaches are quite different in that regard. Do they necessarily mean that you have to have a positivist philosophy of science? Well, if you're going to be able to make, you're going to need to be able to make precise predictions if you're going to control a system in a way that they envisage being able to do it. So I think he was getting at something there that was actually pretty profound in terms of just the way you conceptualize the world. Your idea of how the world works is quite different in those two different models. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about the nomination of Hayek for the Nobel and clearly the Myrdal, the pairing is interesting, but were there other pairings considered? Do we know anything about that?
So there's all sorts of rumors. It's a secret process. Myrdal was one of the, I am a Hayek scholar, but even if I weren't, I would not have liked Myrdal. He was a self-important kind of guy. Everybody in Sweden, it's a small enough country, amongst the intelligentsia, knew that he was angling for the Nobel Prize, but would never say it. It could have been just something that some of the people who were in Sweden who were sick of him wanted to do, to say, hell, why don't we just give it to both of them, So, I've heard that story, and I think it's at least plausible. The continuation of the feud, though, was really bad. So Hayek and Myrdal get it in 74. In 76, Milton Friedman gets it, and he had visited Chile and given advice to Pinochet. He also had visited China and given advice to the Chinese government. So he was somebody who would give advice to whoever asked him to come. And Myrdal writes an article in Swedish decrying giving the Nobel Prize to Friedman. He said they should get rid of the Nobel Prize in economics, that it had become a political thing. And then he went on to reflect on his joint acquisition of the prize with Hayek with the following words. He said, thinking about the prize that I shared with Hayek, thousands of cablegrams I received from colleagues all over the world, mostly informing me that they were deeply critical of the Nobel Prize being given to von Hayek. Can you imagine saying something like that in a newspaper article? And he went on to say, ending the piece, that he regrets that he took it, that he accepted the prize. His excuse was, I should have declined to receive it, particularly as I did not need the money but gave it away because I'm such a great guy, you know. But I had not then thought the problem through. I was merely disgusted. This is something that he puts in about a fellow Nobel Prize recipient after Friedman got his prize. So it was there was a certain arrogance and nastiness in this person that I found, that I think a lot of people found kind of repugnant.
I've always been struck by the fact that Hayek's use of the garden as a metaphor for a liberal economy is the same that Antoine de Montchatien used as a metaphor for a mercantilist economy. But
we'll have to talk about that.
My question is a follow-up here. I'm struck by the contrast that this year's Nobel Prize winners in economics are not only involved in a broadly shared approach, but they are in fact frequent co-authors, which seems to be the case more recently. Was it the case back at this time that the Nobel Prize Committee tended to choose rivaling ideas?
No, not jointly. I mean, I think this was kind of a one-off. But certainly the change that has taken place in economics in the 50 years since this Nobel have been very profound. And you do tend to get people who are jointly, it's often 2 or 3 people awarded in the same year. The one where there was slight rivalry might have been when Vernon Smith got it and also Kahneman got it, because they took really 2 different approaches to experimental economics. But the field is much more of a field where you don't have these individual names that everyone knows anymore. You have areas within economics, and within those areas, there are people who are quite prominent, and they're the ones who get it. Someone like Friedman could write on so many different topics. Hayek was more philosophical, but he wrote on monetary theory. A lot of people thought he wasn't making much sense about it, but I mean, he was contributing to these things. And if you look in the first 15 to 20 years, I would say these were prominent people. I don't know if Ross would disagree with that, but that it has tended to change a bit, perhaps in the last 20, 25 years.
It has become a lot more like the other sciences in terms of winning the Nobel, because people win for very narrow, specific advances earlier in their career and the like. We have a question over here.
My question is based on what scientific success looks like, because if it's based on predictive power, that's a much clearer answer. But it seems like at the end of your talk, you talked about Hayek talking about protecting against bad policy, and it seems like in that view, success is a bit quieter. So how would Hayek have responded to a world like today where sciences have to justify and prove their usefulness? What would his solution be?
Yeah. So I'll just choose one example. In terms of how to be a prophylactic against bad policies, okay? Most of what Hayek's vision of a well-functioning market system consisted of was one where prices were allowed to find their own level, okay? That you don't have price controls. If you think of many of the textbook examples of price controls and the analysis that you would get in an intro textbook on it, about how they are often put into place with good intentions, to assist, you know, renters with rent controls or farmers with agricultural price supports, low-income workers with minimum wage laws, and then look at the actual effects of those policies in terms of the people that they were intended to try to benefit and the mismatch between them. I think that that's the kind of idea that Hayek was saying, that there is an amount of basic economic reasoning. Yeah, you don't want to, when the economy is at 3.5% unemployment, to have another $1.9 trillion increase in government spending to take care of a problem that has already resolved itself in the COVID crisis with the final stimulus, which I think in many ways, I mean, I'm not an empirical economist, so I'm sure that you would need to do a much more careful thing, but just in common sense, you don't want to pump a lot of money into the economy when you've got supply chain issues and very low unemployment rate, and it's going to produce inflation, and we did get that inflation. So again, that's getting into a macro area where I think Hayek would be even less comfortable about saying it, but it is a kind of notion that, yeah, you don't want inflation to get started. Once inflation gets started, it's really hard to get rid of. I mean, what ended up happening in the stagflation of the 70s is what Hayek said, except that instead of doing it in 74, it was in 1980 with Volcker really raising interest rates to almost 20% in order to get rid of the inflation. And it was very painful and had worldwide impact in terms of less developed countries really having a hard time as a result of it. So you can make some real bad mistakes with stuff that sounds good. I think that's a basic message that Hayek was trying to get across.
Well, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Bruce for this really interesting talk, and so please thank him.
Thank you. And it's nice to be able to see you too, so it's been great.